All right, well, welcome. I'm Karen Pearson. I chair the sustainability effort here at FIT, and today it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with an environmental activist and author, Leah Thomas, to talk about her work and to share some of her experiences with us and our community about really how she's creating pathways to action through her work and through her discussions, which happen so her most recent publication, The Intersectional Environmentalist, which we'll talk to, is such a perfect mesh for this year's conference theme, where we really are looking at intersectional pathways that are creating progress in the space of addressing the sustainability pillars in context of our greatest global challenges. So Leah, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to FIT and to have you share your experience with us. So it would be excellent if you could really tell us a little bit about your background, your story, and really what led you to become a passionate communicator about environmentalism and also social and environmental justice.
Of course, and thank you so much for having me virtually. But my name is Leah Thomas. I also go by Green Girl Leah on the internet. That was the blog that I started when I was in college, my last year. And I've always been really passionate about ecosystems, ecology, plants and animals. Thought I was going to be a veterinarian, but little did I know that environmental science and policy would kind of steal my heart a little bit later on. So I am a bit of a science nerd, I will admit. But when I found a program that combined environmental science with policy, I honestly just fell in love because I thought it was so cool to see the ways that I could really understand the climate science, but then also the pathways to create change in local and federal governments and grassroots organizing. But to rewind a little bit, I started out as a biology student my freshman year, and then I knew something wasn't quite right because I was only enjoying my classes about the environment. So the summer between my freshman and sophomore year, I decided to declare a major as an environmental science and policy student when I was back home in St. Louis, Missouri. And unfortunately, that summer after I had made that decision was the summer of the Ferguson uprisings, which was kind of one of the starting points of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. And that happened about 10 minutes away from my house. And I really just had to deal with the aftermath of what a community or how a community would transform because of social injustice. And my family was very active in protests and vigils and conversations. And then I had to fly back to California to start my environmental science program about 2 weeks later. And understandably, I was very distracted and was really trying to think of ways that I could help in the social justice space. And as I was studying environmental science, I started to find some solutions there, which I didn't know existed initially, but that maybe I could help in the world of social justice by ensuring that everyone had their basic environmental human rights, so access to clean air, clean water, etc. Because to me, I was like, this is one solution that's maybe not being explored enough that could also help with social injustice and improve people's livelihoods. So it was a kind of roundabout way of always loving science and then, being really passionate about social justice, especially after it impacted my hometown. And yeah, then that's how I got into it for the first time.
I think that's really powerful. And in saying that, what you really also did is cite, I think, 6 or 7 explicit portions of the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are really goals that the UN has put out as global challenges, and you started looking at them at, for lack of a better word, at a more local level, which seems to be such an impactful way to have an impact on the community and within your peer group, both from a student perspective, but also more of your peers within your community as a whole. And such an impactful bit to have the opportunity to study and consider these challenges at that time, because the intersection, I think, of environment and policy provides so much opportunity for us for growth on a local and national level, but also on a global stage as well. So I think that's I think those are really key kind of points and awareness moments for how you ended up in that space of really environmental activism. Because to me, all of your points are very action oriented. Your family's points were action oriented in their action in response to the Ferguson riots, and also how you took and applied that as a point to say, look, we're going to have action and keep moving forward. So I think that's a really exciting component. And I love the connection on a personal level to thinking about them in the context of the sustainable development goals, because that helps apply the importance of both local work and putting that more on a global stage as well, and realizing that these local actions really make a big difference on our whole global platform. So I think we're already really touching on this next component, but which is to have you speak a little bit more about some of these intersectional points, because this intersectional component is really key to our theme of our conference. And in that you have both a blog and you are now a published author, where you are very specifically looking at intersectional points, to the point that the title of your new book is really called The Intersectional Environmentalist. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about how you started maybe creating the blog, and then we can go on and talk a little bit more about your book, and about the goals you had, not just in creating it, but how you actually told that story and how you ended up with that as both the title and the theme going forward.
Absolutely. And sometimes I guess things aren't significant until later on, but when I was in school, and I didn't know this while while it was happening, like, oh, I'm entering the world of intersectional environmentalism, but it's kind of funny looking back because I was studying environmental science and policy. I was observing and getting involved with the Black Lives Matter movement. My minor or cluster was comparative world religions, so I'm learning about all these different things. And then I also was learning about feminism and intersectional theory and, sociology and those sorts of things. So, and ecofeminism, I think that's another really important thing to throw in the mix. So I was learning about all of these things when I was in college, and I think especially religion and environment, right after social justice, that really stood out to me because in so many global religions, even though I'm not a religious person, I love studying it and studying spirituality. I started seeing all of these nature themes or themes about, people caring about the planet because they might view it as one of God's creations. And I thought, how interesting would it be for me to start talking to churches and seeing if I could activate them for climate justice? So that's something that I have done in the last couple of years, like going into spaces and kind of meeting people where they're at and seeing how that one aspect of their identity might relate to the way that they care for the earth or activate them for climate action, and not, judging people, but meeting them where they're at. And I think also when I was in school, I was learning about intersectional theory and how people's overlapping identities, whether it's, gender and race, income, spirituality, sexuality, so on, how those things can compound and impact the way someone experiences the world around them and the way the world experiences them. And not to go off in too much of a side tangent, but I think the best way for me to understand intersectional theory was going back to its roots in the legal world. There was a court case with General Motors back in the 80s where all of the Black women specifically were fired from that specific location. However, when they brought it to the court said, well, there are still Black men that are employed at GM, so this is not a civil rights issue. And there are still white women who are employed at GM, so this is not a women's issue. And with intersectional theory, when Kimberly Crenshaw was looking at that case, she was saying, well, it's compounding factors that are at play here. These are specifically Black women who are facing discrimination. These things are compounding. And we can't just say it's not this, it's not that, because it can be both. And that's why we should consider these overlapping identities or intersectional theory, as she calls it, so we can make sure there's no like loopholes in the legal system that lead to people not being protected. So that's how I understand intersectional theory. And when it comes to environmentalism, I also think it's important to understand compounding factors and how it leads to different environmental outcomes, whether we're talking about kind of negative things, like if you're low income, that's one compounding factor that might lead to you experiencing environmental injustice. If you're a person of color, that compounds on top of it oftentimes when it comes to environmental injustice outcomes. And then also looking at it in the positive, which I also really love, like how does your religion play into the way that you might value this world, or gender when we're talking about things like ecofeminism? Like there's just so many fun things to also explore when you're considering culture in the context of the environment. So it didn't really answer your question, but because of all of that, I just thought this is so cool. I really want to start writing about these intersections, some of the negatives, with environmental injustice outcomes, and then some of the fun stuff about culture and environment. And that led me to starting my blog, and then eventually starting my nonprofit, Intersectional Environmentalist, which specifically focuses on education across all of these nuances and intersections.
Oh, well, I actually think it was a perfect thing. And I know I date myself by this, but I actually remember studying that case that you referenced with GM. It was actually part of one of our debate challenges. I was on the debate team. Again, things I shouldn't totally admit to, but I did debate when I was in high school. And this was one of our many cases that we actually explored and did in class because our teacher actually felt that it was a very difficult one to have. And I think it was really almost progressive of her to feel that this was a topic we were going to address because it wasn't necessarily a standard one at that time. We were looking at it, now it was many years actually after that case in the 80s, but it was still something that I think was experienced by a lot of people. And I think part of what really resonated for me with what you were talking about was the need to meet people where they are. There are other authors who have spoken of that, and people who have really talked about the importance of community and taking community where you are. And speaking of it, both Michelle and Barack Obama also spoke of this in their books as well. And the importance of going into communities and understanding how communities were experiencing certain items with them and using that to inform how you would think about moving forward in that space. So I actually think that your kind of awareness of that was, in my mind, really spot on, because I think so often we forget the importance of that. In a college classroom and in an educational setting, we're often given that freedom to have that, right? We get to sit with our students, we get to talk about these issues. But in some cases, that experience of going out and thinking about them in the community sense is also important. And education is something that doesn't really necessarily happen within the silos of a traditional educational institution. And I think that's, much of what you were really speaking of too, which is that the intersectionality really plays into theories and principles that are part of interdisciplinary study that crosses boundaries, that explores and goes well beyond traditional silos. I personally, as a scientist, I've spent much of my work working on creating opportunities in STEAM education, looking at these intersectional parts where art fits into the equation and business fits into the equation, and where we look at solving problems and creating curriculum and study that focuses on those as part of how we're moving forward, not looking at them in a traditional bit, understanding that scientific literacy is what's maybe most important in a general context. And that's, understanding principles in chemistry and biology and physics, but then also understanding how those are applied in a very visual and in many cases also then a very business context. So I actually think your intersectional points are spot on. They speak to many things that I see, and I love that we're now connecting this specific intersectionality and the need for literacy in this space to be not just about the environmental impact, but also about the social and the economic impacts. And those really get to in my mind, to the key pillars in sustainability. If we go back and look at the early work in sustainability, now we speak often of 4 key pillars, but historically speaking, or such as that might be, the 3 key pillars were really the environmental component, the social component, and the economic component, and the intersection of all of those spaces. I think we're really touching on all of that, even in these new space and place where we've really created room for a 4th pillar. And I hope we continue to keep room for growth in this space, because as we have intersection and cross disciplines, I think we will see an expansion of that in a place where these boundary lines just aren't as firmly defined. the circle diagram should no longer make sense, even though that's what we like to use.
Yeah.
Um,
And then just yeah, to go off of that, I've been speaking to a lot of different college students, and environmental justice classes are not always mandatory within a lot of environmental science programs. I've heard some people say, well, environmental studies, we sometimes focus on environmental justice, but in my school, it wasn't mandatory. I know they're trying to make it mandatory, which is really exciting. But I think to be able to kind of firmly root that social component within that equation, then everyone who's studying environmental science, in my opinion, should have some sort of requirement where they're talking about it. Because if they're not, even if there is that diagram, they'll say, well, if all of my classwork is specifically about understanding the climate science behind the climate crisis or talking about, renewable energy or all these sorts of things, ecosystems, ecology, the balance, it's not there. The social is all the way down here and everything else is amplified. So I think it would be great to see some sort of balance where we're also talking about economics and that social component, etc. Because I'm not really seeing it at a lot of universities, but I also haven't audited every university in the country, so it could be happening.
well, I think you're spot on, which is I think we are starting to see it in pockets. I think we are starting to see it demanded or students to create those own kind of pathways and that own kind of interdisciplinary component in this. But I think we also still think about the fact that, you don't graduate from even high school without basically math and language proficiency. So at what point do you graduate? At what point do you continue to move through the academic process where some of these other topics are now considered to be just as fundamental as the core principles that we've been kind of taught over all of these years, right? I mean, I think I'd love to see an interdisciplinary course become parts of our college requirements for all students, regardless of their major in their program. And obviously, those who are studying in environment and in policy and those related would take additional coursework in that space. But I think part of being a good global citizen will also continue to include and embed these principles. And I think that we're starting to see that at FIT. We have, you wouldn't consider FIT necessarily to be the traditional place you might go to study this, but we increasingly have students who every year we continue to grow our minor in ethics and sustainability. And that's really getting at many of these topics. That's a set of students who each year are growing by approximately 10% who are choosing to take that interdisciplinary core of courses that you mentioned, because you take a course specifically in basically all the pillars of sustainability to add that minor to your degree. And we're seeing additional curriculum and requirements by our major programs in business and in design to include some of these topics and these courses within their programs for students. So I think in higher education, there is much progress in this space, but it's certainly, we can't stop with much progress. We must continue to work forward in that. I'd love to give you a little bit of time to talk about your book, um, about the themes, about what you hope to capture in your book, what you want when readers read your book, what you hope for them both to learn and to take away, and what kinds of points you wish for them to move forward with.
Yeah, and I happen to have a copy right here, so I'm like, yay, this book. But yeah, so I wrote this book really as kind of a primer to all things environmental justice and maybe selfishly the book that I wanted as a first year environmental science and policy student. Things that I started to learn later on, like I told you about, like in a social class, I started learning about privilege and something called like the Horatio Alger myth or something that explains like privilege and the pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality in the US. And it might seem like something, but that was crucial to me understanding environmental justice. I also really wanted to learn about some unsung heroes. So the father of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Bullard, and all the studies he conducted on the placement of toxic waste sites and air quality, etc., and the mother of environmental justice, a Black woman named Hazel M. Johnson from Chicago. So I just wanted to include as much introductory information that I could that was rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and environmentalism at the same time for anyone who's kind of starting their environmental journey. So whether they're a traditional environmental student, in high school or in college or grad school, or if it's someone who's just new to the world of environmentalism, there's just a lot of things in here that I just really hope that people, take a glance at. And this book, in many ways, is a primer to start their journey. So there's so many resources about organizations that they can, stay in touch with, or other books that they can read. But it's really an argument for why we can't separate talking about the protection of the earth from talking about the protection of people. And kind of the thesis statement is that there are endangered animals and there are also endangered people. So we should care about that in the context of environmentalism and conservation, etc. So it's a short book, but it's also a bit dense because I just got so excited and was like, I want to include this that I learned in my religious studies class and include this, that, and the other. And not only that, there's 30 contributors from around the world kind of talking about what intersectional environmentalism means to them. So very introductory text. It's my first book. I'm really excited. And yeah, I hope people enjoy it.
I think that's excellent, and I love the idea that you view it as a primer, as kind of a starting point for a journey and or a set of studies in this area, or a set of simply thinking about considering some of these topics in the areas where you have had more extensive study, or have, a broader knowledge base on a personal level. Because I always like to remind people, a lot of times we get our broad knowledge not from the work we did in the classroom, but the classroom work we've done has informed our ability to learn these things and apply and make these connections going forward. So I love your kind of point about the importance of connections, and that you wanted to write the book that you didn't have. I took courses as well in actually environment and policy when I was in college, and you are correct that many of these books did not exist. There was many texts that were very solely spaced in the environmental science area and the application and the technologies associated with that, but the connections into what are sometimes considered, I hate to call them the softer sciences, but the more sciences that are associated with sociology and psychology, the connections weren't there in those primer texts. We weren't talking about how those things felt in that space. So I think this is a strong movement forward in that zone. So I'm so excited to have there be resources for students, and resources for the community at large who really do want to consider these topics when they think about the impact that they're having and the impact it has on their communities and in the future generations.
Thank you so much.
So, for a reader of your book, we've talked a lot about this, and for your followers, we've talked a lot about how these intersectional points, and these are really primers. Is there one kind of core principle or concept you might hope that your readers take away from either the blog or from the book itself?
That's a good question because I wish I could throw like 10 things at you right now, but I would say one of the most important.
You're allowed to throw 10. It's okay.
Maybe like two. But I think one of the important ones is just you never have to separate parts of your identity from your advocacy for the planet. And I think that's something that I felt really deeply, whether I was talking about, being a feminist or also talking about, very proudly embracing my Black identity and culture and advocacy for my people. And I've been in a lot of different spaces, and I'm glad that I got to test out a lot of things in college and early on in my career, whether it was working at my dream job at Patagonia headquarters or as a park ranger intern or in an environmental science lab, whatever it was. But in all of these spaces, even if it was in passing, I've heard people say things along the lines of, racial justice is like over here, sustainability is over here, or maybe we can circle back to racial justice like after we've figured out the climate crisis and that sort of things, or just some things of it not being as urgent or as important as what they were valuing as important. And then I started to realize over time, like, that's absolutely not fair. Me wanting to advocate for my people and other marginalized communities is one of the most urgent things to me and many people. And I think that it should be urgent to them. So never kind of giving into that feeling, which I gave into oftentimes of like, okay, maybe racial justice can take a back seat and I'll go to a protest about salmon and talk about endangered salmon. And maybe one day they'll, care about my people. But you don't have to do that because I think that my culture and all of our cultures flow through our environmental practices, whether we know it or not. So whether it's like people who are religious at the churches that I speak to, and they care about the earth largely because they view it as one of God's creations, and that's why they're environmental stewards. And with me, it's because of my ancestors and their connection with the natural world, which kind of, goes beyond slavery, but as African Americans catering to the land and using the stars to find freedom, and how those sort of themes were passed down from my great grandparents to my grandparents to me. And I think that is part of my special connection to why I love the earth so much. So if our cultures at times inform why we care for the earth, they shouldn't have to take a back seat in our environmental advocacy. So I just really want students to understand that they can take up space and come to the environmental movement as they are, and they don't have to be anyone that they're not. Um, and then other than that, I threw in a bunch of data and studies in this book too. There's a whole chapter, just breakdowns of different data. Um, but yeah, numbers don't lie. So when it comes to environmental injustice and the, determinants of it, there's a pretty strong case that, race is one of the number one indicators in the US, and globally, but it's a bit more nuanced, of where environmental hazards will occur. And that's really closely connected to like redlining and city planning and different things like that. So yeah, I think that's another thing that I want people to take away from this book. Like, this is a problem that's backed in data, but there are solutions that are available, and we can create those solutions together. But we can't get anywhere with denial of the data. So I don't know. I really hope that data also helps shift some minds that might be a little bit like, I don't understand what race has to do with it. It's like, well, read chapter 4. I'll tell you all about it.
Well, I think you're really highlighting the importance of collaboration and connection, and the importance of being respectful of where everybody is, and understanding that those backgrounds and those perceptions are different, but collaboratively, there's certainly space to consider all of these topics and move forward and start to address the biggest global challenges that face us. And these challenges are not isolated in individual boxes. I think that's maybe to me, that's probably one of the key points in what you were just saying, which is we can't really address the concept of climate change if we think about it in terms of ocean rising temperature, in terms of air temperature, or different weather patterns, without considering its connections to really the social and the economic components of it, because they do not live in single boxes. The original Venn diagram overlaps it very, very distinctly. And I think these points and that overlap and that need now for collaborative solutions that include buy-in and work in all of the spaces will really move us forward and onto a new pathway. So I think those are very, very key points. And I really think, I think it's unfair of me now to ask what I was going to finally ask you, but I'm going to do it anyway. And you can repeat what you just said, which is, how would you like to inspire and inform both the current and the next generation of change makers as they consider a pathway forward in our world?
I think I'll expand on what I said earlier, but the importance of being yourself. I know that might sound so cliche, but you don't have to be anyone else. Like for me, I'm a little shy, and I think reserved is a better word, but I'm an introvert, and that's why I'm a writer, because you can write and process for days and days and then, put it out on paper. But by leaning into that strength of mine, maybe I'm not the person to hold a megaphone. But by leaning into that, my pen and paper is my megaphone. And I had a mentor of mine that said once, like, every movement needs an accountant. Like, there's someone who's really good at keeping the books and numbers. And like, if they lended that to grassroots movements and helped create Excel files and like account for things, like, movements need that. We also need someone who's showing up bringing cookies and things like that. So whether you're really into art, whether you're into accounting, writing, whatever it may be, kind of show up as your full self, and you don't have to be anyone you're not, and apply that to the movements that you care about.
Oh, I love it. I think that is a perfect point to end on. And I think every good movement absolutely needs somebody who brings some cookies. I mean, maybe some ice cream to go with that. But
I agree. Ice cream sandwiches would be good. Maybe it's a little particular, but yeah.
if we're being picky here, well, yeah, this was such an inspiring conversation. I really hope everybody will take a chance to look at your book and to consider these intersectional points and to realize that the pillars of sustainability and eco and environmental justice are really accessible to everybody. And they are part of all of our big movements, both in terms of climate change, but also in terms of social justice moving forward. And it's really been my great pleasure to have an opportunity to chat with you today and also to have you be part of looking at these concerns within for us here at FIT as part of our conference this year. So thank you.
So much for having me.